Happy Monday, y'all. I hope you're having a good start to the week. This is Lance, co founder BH Capital Enterprises, also team leader of the Abacus Group. And today's topic is going to be centered around cannabis. So, my goal is to every Wednesday release videos with that specific topic, overall topic being cannabis. But of course, I'll be talking about different things within that overall umbrella or whatever you want to call it. So, excuse me. Just going back to the days before I launched my subscription platform, the Greenhouse. I started out really doing webinars, and I choose various topics and various cannabis industry topics. And I used to do webinars, maybe every couple of months, every quarter or so. But then it got to the point where people were kind of demanding a bit more from me. So then I launched the Greenhouse, where people would have access to all kinds of information um, dealing with the cannabis industry on a regular basis. So recently, I made some big changes, another shift as far as the greenhouse is concerned, or as far as my cannabis offer is concerned. And now I focus specifically on evaluating companies. I'm actually working on a project where I my goal is to evaluate every single publicly traded cannabis company and put them all in a spreadsheet. I think eventually I'll move into, public, not publicly, but privately held companies and maybe pre-IPO companies and things like that, and just add those to the spreadsheet eventually. But first, I want to get through all of the publicly traded companies, or as many as I can find, at least. So I focus on evaluating companies, and I also focus on a more advanced offering or advanced type offering where I do cannabis options alerts. So whatever cannabis companies that allow you to trade options, you find those companies on that in that particular offering, and about every week or so at least, I put out alerts for a small group of companies. Usually, I put out up to about six, well, 4 to 6 every weekend, and we just watch and wait for those options to go live, as I call them. I can put out an alert on Sunday, but that alert may not go live until a few days later or even a few weeks later. So important to keep our eyes on those alerts as much as we possibly can. So I try not to put out as so many, because it's difficult to even keep track of the few that I do put out on a weekly basis. So that's been the latest big shift with my cannabis offering. But in the early days of my teaching on the cannabis industry, I educated people on kind of what may be considered the legislative cycle, or the overall cycle of the cannabis industry. So in the old days, and I mean, cannabis industry old, so, it might be, maybe 2 years ago, the industry would run like clockwork during certain parts of the year. So you could really, in the early part of the year, late winter, early spring, you could just find your companies and buy up shares and just hold them to when it starts to approach the end of the year, and the cannabis industry would just run as we would head into certain legislative cycles, and those huge legislative catalysts were significant, really significant for the industry. But now, even back then, I told my subscribers, I said, very soon there will come a time where these catalysts will become less significant in terms of their impact on price movement, and investors and traders, well, mostly investors, especially from fundamental perspective, investors will want to see the numbers. They will want to see management doing the best that they can with their financials. Um, so you know, we're moving into a new phase of the cannabis industry where it's becoming where huge revenues is becoming less and less significant in terms of how it impacts the price movement as well. So we can't, now in this phase we can no longer say, well, the election is coming up, so let's, look at our little basket of cannabis companies that are our long term, that we consider our long term offering, or even, this basket of companies I plan to only hold through the legislative cycle. I just want to get a nice return on my money. That's not really happening as much anymore. You know what I'm saying? So now it's becoming more about, can you identify great companies with great potential in the future? So we're not looking at who's making the most revenue, and who has the most um, square footage in terms of growth space. It's becoming more and more about how management is navigating not only the legislative landscape, but how they are navigating that internally with their financials. So you'll see companies like Canopy that I believe 2019, last time I looked, they brought in or generated like over $200 million, US dollars at that, in revenue, but they're not profitable. So investors aren't, a lot of cannabis companies are getting hammered lately, and pretty much for most of 2019 that was the case, where the entire cannabis industry took a hit, really, and especially the more popular companies, Kronos, Canopy, Aurora, etc. They took, significant hits, um, because they are failing to meet expectations now. Now that the industry is still in its infancy, but now as it continues to get older year by year, the expectation is starting to shift a bit. So, they can't, put out a post or a news release now and say, oh, company XYZ is fully funded for 100,000 square feet of additional growth space or whatever. And 2 years ago, that would send the stock running, because the expectation of investors was different in that time. It was all about potential. Oh, company XYZ, 100,000 square foot of additional growth space. That means that, and they already have the capability of growing, X amount of product in this growth space, and that's going to translate to potentially, I'm just throwing a random number out there, $10 million in annual revenue added to their top line. Boom, stock goes wild. Big money being made, or big money opportunity missed. That used to happen a lot, but now that the cannabis industry is transitioning into this new phase, that doesn't matter as much. So what investors want to see now is more profitable companies. They want to see companies that are being a lot more smart with their resources. So you had companies like Aurora that were just acquiring everything moving, like in at the expense of serious dilution of their stock, and that was kind of the name of the game, especially for the quote unquote big boys in the industry. But now investors are looking, they're saying, okay, I've been holding, Aurora for, 5 years now or whatever, and I'm in the hole. you know I don't see, although I see it on the top line with all these acquisitions and their revenue is growing, but their expenses are far outpacing their revenues, or just things like that. So investors are paying more attention to those financials these days. I would say probably the biggest catalyst that still awaits right now is federal legalization in the United States. I believe that's like the catalyst that will probably blow the top off the cannabis industry. Um, but I like to remain, sort of neutral, or as neutral as I possibly can. And there's a chance that the markets might shrug that off. But the U.S. is a huge market, especially for cannabis. We got California, and California is a market that just that one state has a lot more economic activity in terms of cannabis than some countries. So very significant markets here in the United States. So that final piece of the puzzle would just spell so much potential for the global market, really, and especially the market here in the United States. So we're still behind the curve on that, but I think maybe in the next 4 or 5 years we may see some federal legalization, unless they just decide to be completely hands off and say, hey, we're just gonna stay out of it and let the states do what they want to do. But then there's the issue of transporting state to state and stuff like that. So it's gonna have to be addressed at some point. Um, but yeah, so there's definitely a shift happening in the cannabis industry. You can't necessarily evaluate it in the way that we used to when I first opened up my subscription platform and started teaching on cannabis. So cannabis is one of those industries that, while it's still young, it evolves rapidly. So technology and retail and things like that took many, many, many years to get to the point of where they are now with, AI replacing humans and stuff like that. But it's like the cannabis industry came out the gate with those things in mind and putting those things in place. So uh, bud tenders were automatically being replaced with machines, and in the grow houses, technology was out the gate being developed to monitor the growing process and claim to do better than humans can do. So any way that these companies can save on the overhead side, on the expense side, um, they've adopted these processes, but it comes at a cost also. And then on top of the already burdensome costs with having a cannabis company, because governments are greedy, they like to have their hand in it out for everything. Um, it's burdening the industry as a whole, and especially when you consider Canada, where I believe they are capped. Companies are capped at the amount of money that they can charge for a particular cannabis, for flower or a particular cannabis product. So they're capped at the per gram price for flower. So the aim is to reduce costs as much as you possibly can. Um, but even that's not enough. And that's clearly evidenced by these companies' financials when you look at them. And there aren't many cannabis companies that have, you know, nice fundamentals and financials. I mean, when you look at the income statement, the balance sheet, and the cash flow statement. So that's, you know, it's so many, issues and challenges at every turn for this industry. So it's just going to be a kind of a transitional thing from one phase to the next that, if you're cognizant enough to observe, it's something that you can learn from as an observer and as a participant in the markets that you can capitalize on. So hopefully, I provided you guys with some useful information that you can consider as you choose cannabis stocks, or as you begin to conduct your research on the cannabis industry. So just something to think about. But I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Again, happy Monday. I hope you guys have a great rest of your week. Actually, this video will be released on Wednesday, but I'm currently recording it on Monday, so maybe I should say happy Wednesday. And I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your week. Thanks for listening.